Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something massive. We're unpacking a deeply complex and, frankly, globally significant topic, the strategic intricacies of the US-Iran conflict. But we're going to be looking at this specifically through the realist geopolitical lens of Professor John Mearsheimer. We're going to map out the raw strategic realities, the on-the-ground military calculations, and the massive global economic ripples of this entire situation.
Okay, let's dive into this. We have a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to start right at the epicenter with the concept of a failed quick victory, then move outward to the economic choke point, analyze the balance of leverage, examine why Israel is on the sidelines, and finally zoom all the way out to look at the global superpower winners.
To really set the stage here, we need to look at Professor Mearsheimer's core thesis, and he puts it pretty bluntly. He says, I think we went to war because we thought that we could win a quick and easy victory. This was a cockamamie idea. See, the initial expectation from the US and Israel was that a massive shock and awe campaign would just decapitate the Iranian regime, bring them to their knees, and force a favorable deal. But as we're about to see, the grim realities on the ground prove that initial expectation to be fundamentally flawed.
All right, Section 1, the failed quick victory. Let's look at the specific military tactics that kick this off.
Things moved incredibly fast, and honestly, they didn't go as planned. It all started on February 28th with a 40-day strategic bombing campaign. When that didn't break Iranian resolve, the strategy quickly shifted on April 13th to a naval blockade. But, well, that failed too. Ultimately, this rapid sequence of events led to June 17th when President Trump signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU with Iran. Now, according to Mearsheimer's analysis, because the Iranian demands were met on almost every single point, this MOU was basically a surrender document. It was a formal acknowledgement that the initial military approaches just hadn't worked.
And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic corner the US found itself in. If we literally cross off the military options one by one, it's pretty eye-opening. Number 1, strategic bombing, failed after 40 days. Number 2, a naval blockade, failed to force a surrender. Number 3, a land invasion. Well, Mearsheimer argues that's outright impossible, and I'll explain exactly why in just a second. So what does that leave? It leaves number 4, which is our current reality, a tit-for-tat strategy of daily, limited strikes. And historically speaking, that is incredibly ineffective at bringing a tough adversary to its knees.
Now, why is a land invasion impossible? To understand that, you have to look at the actual math. People hear the number 50,000 thrown around a lot for total U.S. troops in the region, but Mearsheimer estimates the U.S. has, at absolute most, about 6,000 actual combat infantry and Marines available. Think about that. 6,000 trigger pullers to invade a country with forbidding mountainous terrain, a highly formidable military, and a population of 93 million people. It's simply not a realistic option. Which brings us to Section 2. The economic choke point. Because when military options run dry, the conflict spills over into the region's waterways.
This is where the lifeblood of the global economy is literally at stake. Let's look at the crucial oil math here. Historically, about 20% of the world's oil and gas comes right through the Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled by Iran. When hostilities flared up, Saudi Arabia and the UAE cleverly utilized bypass pipelines, routing oil to Yanbu on the Red Sea and Fujairah in the UAE. That maneuver actually managed to save about 7% of that global supply. But, and this is a massive but, that still leaves a 13% deficit cutoff from the global market. To put that into perspective, a sudden 13% drop in global oil would be an absolute disaster for international markets. But wait, because Iran's strategic positioning gets even more intense. If the US decides to escalate, let's say by attacking Iranian power grids, Iran has a very specific countermove locked and loaded. They have made it abundantly clear that they will instruct their allies, the Houthis, to shut down the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the end of the Red Sea. If that happens, you know that 7% lifeline we just talked about? It gets completely neutralized. We'd be looking at the global economy stepping straight over a cliff.
Moving right along to Section 3, a balance of leverage. In a protracted war of attrition like this, we have to step back and impartially ask, who actually holds the upper hand? To figure that out, we need to understand a concept called coercive leverage. It's basically the ability to inflict massive, unbearable economic or political pain until your adversary finally just capitulates. Mearsheimer identifies this specific type of leverage as the absolute crux of why Iran holds a strategic advantage as this drags on.
Just look at how the two sides approach this. The U.S. relies heavily on inflicting targeted military and economic damage. And it hurts, absolutely.
But the Iranian strategy, it's built entirely on absorbing that punishment because they view this conflict as a literal existential threat. They are willing to suffer enormously. It's actually very much like how the populations of Germany and Japan absorbed massive strategic bombing in World War II without immediately giving up. But here is the critical difference. Unlike those historical examples, Iran can simultaneously hold the entire global economy hostage by threatening those vital waterways we talked about. That gives them an immense amount of coercive leverage.
Okay, Section 4. Israel on the sidelines. We need to explore a really fascinating strategic paradox here. Now, you might be wondering, why is Israel, a nation that was initially one of the premier champions of taking a hardline stance, currently sitting on the sidelines of this tit-for-tat exchange? Well, it comes down to a clear strategic calculation. First, they learned a hard lesson during the initial 40-day war. Getting directly involved immediately makes them a magnet for Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. Second, from their strategic viewpoint, it's actually highly advantageous to just pass the buck, letting the United States do the heavy lifting of weakening Iran. And third, staying out of the direct U.S.-Iran firefight frees Israel up to refocus their military efforts right on their own border, specifically dealing with Hezbollah and Lebanon.
And make no mistake, Iran is keenly aware of this calculation. In fact, if you look at Article 1 of that June 17th Memorandum of Understanding, it wasn't about the Strait of Hormuz at all. It was actually about Lebanon. Iran used the very first article of that agreement to explicitly state that fighting must stop in Lebanon and Israelis must withdraw. By doing this, Iran directly tied the broader Gulf conflict to Israel's military presence in Lebanon. It was a massive signal that they were going to play absolute hardball on this specific issue in any future negotiations.
Finally, let's zoom all the way out to Section 5, the global winners. How does this localized Middle Eastern conflict dramatically shift global superpower dynamics? So who actually comes out on top here? According to Mearsheimer's realist perspective, the big winners are actually China and Russia. Why? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The United States considers China its principal threat, right? The US desperately wants to pivot its focus and resources to East Asia, but a protracted war in the Gulf completely pins the US military down in the Middle East. Mearsheimer literally describes this exact scenario as manna from heaven for China. Conversely, the US and Israel are categorized here as the losers, mainly because their initial strategic goals failed and the dream of establishing unchallenged regional hegemony has essentially evaporated.
And there is a hidden, truly disastrous cause to continuing this tit-for-tat fight: the munitions drain. This ongoing strategy, much like the earlier campaigns against the Houthis, is burning through huge amounts of precious, highly sophisticated, and highly expensive American weaponry. We're talking about irreplaceable munitions that the United States desperately needs to stockpile for potential future contingencies in places like East Asia. Every single missile fired in the Gulf is literally one less asset available to deter global competitors elsewhere. So, what does this all mean? It brings us to a deeply provocative question. Based on all these strategic realities we've just mapped out, the impossible military options, the economic hostage situation, the shifting leverage, and the major global superpower implications, can there actually be a meaningful peace agreement? Or, as Professor Mearsheimer soberingly concludes, are we simply looking at trouble as far as the eye can see? It's a complex, deeply interconnected web, and any future step the U.S. takes carries enormous global weight. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. We really hope these insights helped clarify the profound depths of this geopolitical conflict. Catch you next time.